Have you ever wondered how a country like the United States manages its enormous national debt and what this means for us as individuals? Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of national debt. From the streets of New York to the global financial stage, we'll unravel how debt influences economies and impacts our daily lives. Stay with us as we explore this crucial topic that shapes nations and dictates global economic trends. If you're finding this discussion insightful and want to stay updated on more such complex economic concepts, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. When discussing debt, especially in relation to the United States, I focus on the debt-to-GDP ratio. This ratio is crucial because it's impossible to assess debt in isolation without considering the capacity to repay it. For a simple analogy, imagine having a $50,000 balance on your credit card while earning just $30,000 a year and trying to cover expenses in an expensive city like New York. In such a scenario, bankruptcy seems inevitable. However, if you owe $50,000 but earn $5 million annually, repaying this debt is trivial. It's merely a matter of writing a check. This example illustrates why you can't judge the severity of a $50,000 debt without comparing it to income. If the income is too low, the debt poses a problem. If it's high, the debt is manageable. This principle underlies the use of the debt-to-GDP ratio. The United States recently hit a $31 trillion national debt, mostly in the form of U.S. Treasury securities, along with other obligations. Whether this level of debt is problematic can be assessed by comparing it to the GDP. Currently, the ratio is a little over 130%. At the start of the Trump administration, it was 106%, meaning Trump and Biden together increased it by 25 percentage points, from 106% to 131%. To put this in perspective, the ratio was only 30% when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, a level considered entirely comfortable. A 30% ratio is like someone with a $50,000 debt earning millions, not a concern. Interestingly, Angela Merkel, during her tenure in Germany, backed by extensive research, suggested that 60% should be the limit. This threshold was also set by the Maastricht Treaty, which established the European Union and the European Central Bank. The treaty stipulated that countries should not exceed a 60% debt-to-GDP ratio, and if they did, they were expected to take measures like raising taxes, reducing debt, or cutting spending to bring it back down. A critical threshold in debt dynamics is when a change occurs rapidly, fundamentally altering the situation, similar to how water turns to steam or ice. Research indicates this critical point is a 90% debt-to-GDP ratio. When the ratio exceeds 90%, the multiplier effect of additional debt falls below 1. For example, at a 30% ratio, borrowing and spending $1 might yield $1.30 in growth, assuming the spending is wise. This productivity of debt diminishes as you approach 90%, dropping to $1.20, $1.10, and then below $1 past 90%. Thus, at ratios above 90%, borrowing $1 and spending it might only generate 95 cents of growth in terms of GDP. The United States, now at 131%, the highest in its history, has surpassed the point where borrowing can lead to growth or resolve a debt crisis. In fact, we are potentially heading towards a significant debt crisis. It's instructive to ask who else is in the same league, with a debt-to-GDP ratio around 130% or higher. Countries like Lebanon, Greece, and Italy find themselves in this category. These are the peers at the debt lunch table with the United States. Stephanie Kelton, a prominent figure in modern monetary theory and a professor at the State University of New York, argues that the level of U.S. debt is not a concern, as it's denominated in its own currency. This perspective contrasts with a country like Argentina, which borrows in dollars but can only print pesos, thus facing default when unable to generate trade surpluses. The United States, however, can print dollars, which theoretically eliminates the possibility of defaulting on dollar-denominated debt. Are you interested in understanding how these economic principles apply to your personal finances? Subscribe to our channel where we break down complex economic jargon into simple, actionable insights. Yet, this doesn't mean there are no adverse consequences. Consider the risks of inflation or hyperinflation and the potential collapse of foreign exchange rates. Modern monetary theorists, who sometimes treat the U.S. as a closed economy, often overlook these international dimensions. If the United States didn't have to worry about trade deficits, capital flows, exchange rates, foreign credit, or China owning $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury securities, the argument against worrying about national debt might hold more weight. Kelton and others in the field argue that the U.S. doesn't necessarily need a bond market, it exists mainly to provide investors with a place to park their money. They claim that if inflation arises, the government could simply raise taxes. Interestingly, they also argue that a tax system isn't needed if the government can just print money, suggesting that taxes are primarily for redistributing income. This view is somewhat socialist in nature, but it's candid about its intentions. If you were to ask a typical member of Congress to define modern monetary theory, you might find they either have never heard of it or don't fully understand it. Nonetheless, the actual behavior of the government, whether aware of it or not, often aligns with MMT principles. Under the Trump administration, a $2 trillion COVID relief package was passed, including an $800 billion paycheck protection plan and $1,200 checks to individuals. At the end of Trump's term, another $1 trillion package was approved, resulting in $600 checks to individuals. These cumulative checks represent what is known as helicopter money. While the Federal Reserve's actions may be debatable, this direct distribution of cash is a clear example of helicopter money, credited to Larry Summers for predicting it would lead to inflation. Upon entering office, President Biden continued with his own COVID relief package, amounting to another $2 trillion, including $1,400 checks to individuals. Later, a $1 trillion infrastructure package was passed, and then a near $1 trillion Green New Deal. The baseline budget deficit, even before these extraordinary measures, was about $1 trillion a year. Adding all these up, $2 trillion from Trump's first package, $1 trillion from the second, $2 trillion from Biden's first package, $1 trillion from the infrastructure package, and another $1 trillion from the Green New Deal, plus the baseline deficit, we have added $9 trillion on top of what was a $21 trillion national debt. This massive accumulation of debt is how we've reached $30 trillion and a debt-to-GDP ratio that soared from 106% to 131%. These figures are staggering, and according to MMT, they should not be a cause for concern. However, they do matter, as evidenced by the slowing growth in the U.S., seen from 2009 to 2019. The worst-case scenario is entering a recession on top of this, leading to fiscal distress. The situation becomes even more complex when considering the supply chain, which has evolved since 1989. Supply chain science involves algorithms, applied mathematics, increased computing power, linear programming, and other techniques to expand and extend supply chains more than ever before. This expansion was primarily driven by cost-cutting motivations, including reducing transportation, labor, energy, inventory, and financing costs. However, this cost-cutting has a hidden price. It has made the supply chain increasingly fragile and less resilient. For example, a loaf of bread involves a complex supply chain from the baker needing a wrapper, transported by a truck, which requires diesel and a driver, to the ingredients sourced from various suppliers. Each link in this chain has its own supply chains, making the entire system vulnerable to breakdowns. The drive for efficiency has led to the creation of ghost cities in places like southern Ning, China. These cities, complete with infrastructure like steel, glass, copper, cement, asphalt, country clubs, hotels, and luxury apartments, are virtually empty. Yet, their construction was debt-financed and created thousands of jobs for several years. This kind of investment, while generating employment, ultimately represents wasted resources. The global supply chain is not just a part of the economy, it is the economy. Everything we use or consume is the product of a complex network of supply chains. When these chains are stretched to cut costs, they become fragile, and when one part fails, the entire system is at risk of collapsing. One concrete example of this fragility is Germany's major car manufacturers like Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, and BMW, which rely on hundreds of miles of wiring in each car. These wires are fed through conduits, often made by a firm in Ukraine. With the outbreak of war in Ukraine, these manufacturers can't get the needed conduits, leading to the shutdown of major automobile assembly lines in Germany. This example illustrates how global events can impact supply chains and, by extension, economies. The creation of ghost cities and such expansive construction projects reveals the extent of debt-financed growth. This model of development, while creating short-term employment, is not sustainable in the long term and leads to wasted resources and increased debt. The U.S. has embarked on similar large-scale spending, such as the COVID relief packages and infrastructure investments. While these expenditures provide immediate relief and stimulate economic activity, they also add to the national debt, raising questions about long-term economic sustainability. Modern monetary theory advocates, like Stephanie Kelton, argue that this level of national debt is not a concern for a country like the United States that borrows in its own currency. They point to Japan, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 280%, and argue that the U.S., with its ability to print dollars, should not worry about defaulting on dollar-denominated debt. This perspective, however, overlooks the potential risks of inflation, hyperinflation, and the collapse of foreign exchange rates. These risks are exacerbated when considering the international aspects of the U.S. economy. Unlike a closed economy, the U.S. must contend with trade deficits, capital flows, exchange rates, and foreign credit. China, for instance, owns a significant portion of U.S. Treasury securities. If the U.S. did not have to consider these external factors, the argument against worrying about national debt might be more compelling. Moreover, MMT advocates argue that the U.S. bond market exists primarily for investors and that inflation can be controlled by raising taxes. They also suggest that a tax system is unnecessary if the government can print money, viewing taxes primarily as a tool for income redistribution. This perspective aligns with a socialist model and is candid in its intentions. In practice, however, the U.S. government's behavior often aligns with MMT principles, whether consciously or not. The COVID relief packages, with their direct cash distributions to individuals, are examples of helicopter money, a term credited to Larry Summers who predicted it would lead to inflation. These policies, while providing immediate relief, also add to the national debt and could have long-term economic consequences. The concept of supply chain science, which emerged in the late 1980s, is another factor to consider. This approach uses algorithms, applied mathematics, and increased computing power to optimize supply chains. Major retailers like Walmart have pioneered techniques like cross-docking to eliminate warehouse costs, contributing to more efficient but also more fragile supply chains. The emphasis on cost-cutting in supply chains has led to a hidden cost, increased fragility, and reduced resilience. This fragility was exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, when disruptions in one part of the supply chain led to widespread shortages and economic impacts. The global supply chain is not merely a part of the economy, it is integral to its functioning. The U.S. response to supply chain challenges is illustrative of a broader trend. The move towards more resilient and less China-dependent supply chains is part of a larger shift in global trade dynamics. This decoupling from China reflects a growing recognition of the need for more secure and sustainable supply chains. As we conclude our deep dive into national debt, remember that knowledge is power, especially in the realm of economics. If you've enjoyed this content and want to support our work, please consider sharing this video with your friends and family. Also, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below on how national debt affects you or any questions you might have. The U.S. is not alone in this shift. Other countries, including those in the European Union, are also reevaluating their supply chain dependencies. The trend towards more localized and resilient supply chains is likely to continue, reshaping global trade patterns in the coming years. In summary, the national debt, particularly in the context of the United States, is a complex issue with far-reaching implications. The debt-to-GDP ratio, fiscal policies, modern monetary theory, and the global supply chain are all interconnected factors that shape the economic landscape. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for navigating the challenges and opportunities of the global economy.